That's better. This is Modern Mindset, the show where we pick the brains of the world's leading minds to help you unlock yours. I'm Adam Cox, and joining me today is clinical hypnotherapist Matt Cullen. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam.
So Matt, give us a bit of background on you and why you became a hypnotherapist.
Sure. So I didn't start out as a hypnotherapist. When I was doing personal change work, I started out doing something called NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming. And at the end of my first training in NLP, there was a day of hypnosis. But I suppose I didn't really take it quite as seriously as the NLP stuff I was doing. Firstly, because the NLP side of things, it really appealed to me as a computer programmer. But also I was slightly led to believe that hypnosis was this thing that was really about suggestion and visualization and basically telling people what to do. And if you tell them what to do often enough, then they just go ahead and do it. And it didn't seem like a very sophisticated way of working. But when I started seeing clients professionally doing purely NLP, I just wasn't getting the same results that I was getting when I was working in the seminar. And the way that I made sense of that was that in the seminar, people had gone through the entire learning process of NLP. They'd had all the necessary beliefs installed so that when we got to the interventions, everything was fairly straightforward. But when I was working with people who came in to see me for a 1-hour therapy session, I didn't have time to program them with everything that we needed to do to make the techniques effective. So I went back to study a bit more NLP. And because there was more NLP, there was also more hypnosis at the end of it. And I took the hypnosis a little bit more seriously this time. Firstly, because it was more sophisticated hypnosis, but also because I was starting to recognize that hypnosis is this thing that's been around for a really, really long time. And NLP is this thing that's been around for about 40 years. And perhaps there's an awful lot in hypnosis that I hadn't really explored and that wasn't being presented to me because there was such a sort of a bias towards the NLP side of things. So I paid more attention to that day of hypnosis in the second NLP seminar I went to, and I pursued it beyond that. I went to do a clinical hypnotherapy training, and one of the things I recognized when I started doing clinical hypnotherapy was that in my NLP training, I'd learned to be something like an agent of change, but I'd never learned to be a therapist. Whereas when I studied clinical hypnotherapy, we were talking a lot more about the dynamic between two individuals. We were talking more about the limitations on what you can and should say. We were talking more about how you evolve a person over a number of sessions rather than trying to identify just one problem and solve just one problem. So hypnotherapy started to become this thing for me that took on a new lease of life at that point, where I could look at a lot of the other therapists who are out there, and not just hypnotherapists, but people in other genres like psychodynamic theory and cognitive behavioral therapy, and to be influenced by them and to incorporate these different styles and approaches into a session that also included a hypnotherapy session towards the end. So I got to use the NLP stuff. I got to use the sort of traditional psychology stuff. I got to use my background in philosophy, but I also got to bring it all together with one kind of final experience that was created in hypnotherapy, so that everything that we've been talking about, which otherwise it could seem like it was just, well, that's a nice idea, but what do you do with that? So that we could take it and turn it into something that actually runs at the unconscious level for the client. So that it's not just something that they're capable of thinking about and understanding and grasping consciously, but so that it's something that sinks down into the unconscious, takes root and grows into the evolution that they were looking for.
So I've seen a few of your talks and heard you explain how you work with clients. You do regular webinars and things like that. One of the things you often refer to is the importance of parts working in collaboration at the unconscious level. Can you give us a bit of background on what that really means and the role that these different parts can play?
Sure. So I guess the first thing to do is talk about what a part is. We kind of intuitively know because it's in our language. You say that, well, there's a part of me that wants to, be more successful at work, and there's a part of me that wants to spend more time with my family. They pull in these sort of opposite directions. But there's actually a reality beyond just the metaphor of parts. And one way that you can understand it is by looking at computers and mobile phones. So on a mobile phone, for example, what you have is you have the physical device, which you could think of as being like your brain, if you like. You have the operating system, which is, the thing that's required to make the phone run. And then you have apps. And apps are rather like parts of the unconscious mind, that they have a very specific purpose and that they weren't necessarily there when you got the phone. They're something that you install at various points whilst you're using it. So parts of the unconscious mind are quite similar to the extent that you're not necessarily born with these parts. They're created in response to highly emotional events, traumatic events more often than not. And they're created as a way of holding together all the resources that you need so that you can always handle the situations of that type in the future. The problem is the way that it holds them together is it often holds all of the negative emotions there because you survived. So it's okay to have negative emotions that come up in those similar situations in the future, as long as you survive. And one of the things that we do with hypnosis is we explore these parts of the unconscious mind to find out, well, what is there and what kind of emotions are wrapped up into those parts. It's a bit different than some other forms of therapy, like transactional analysis. Because transactional analysis, it also has the concept of parts, but it would say that everyone has more or less the same parts. You have an inner adult and an inner child and so on. Whereas in hypnosis, we would say that everyone has a unique collection of parts and that they're created throughout the course of your life. So you're probably not born with any parts, but we don't really know for sure. But they seem to get created as you go through life. And they seem to stick around for life as well. So there are some people who think you can get rid of parts, and that was my first exposure to it in NLP, that there's a technique you can use that's supposed to sort of squash them back into the unconscious and they disappear. But in my experience, parts tend to be resistant to doing that, and it seems more likely to me that you can't get rid of them once they're there, that the only option that you have is to build a relationship with that part of you. So if you have conflict between a part of you that wants to have more friends and a part of you that doesn't want to be embarrassed in social situations, it's not about saying, well, that part of me that doesn't want to be embarrassed in social situations is a bad part that we need to get rid of. It's about, well, how do you help that part to overcome this challenge so that it can work in concert with the part of you that wants to have more friends, so that you think of the conflict as being the problem rather than one side of the conflict as being a problem.
Absolutely. And, it's part of the process of these parts is that sometimes they're vying for control, sometimes they're vying for influence. But I think it was the movie Inside Out, a Pixar movie. Had a nice metaphor. You've got these kind of different emotions kind of inside the head of the girl. And there's almost like the equivalent of Star Trek's kind of captain's chair. But they can't both have the control at the same time. How close is that to kind of what's really going on?
Well, it's hard to say. Anecdotally, that seems to be something that, well, it's hard to say, except that parts are something that when we work in hypnosis, we can speak directly to parts and have a conversation with them. It's quite a remarkable thing to watch if you've never seen it. And it's even more remarkable to do it for the first time, when you take somebody into a profoundly altered state of consciousness, and then you invite one of their parts to step forward and start talking to you. What tends to happen at that moment, being on the receiving end of it, which I've had the privilege a couple of times, immediately that this part steps forwards, you get a very profound emotion that comes up, and a familiar emotion, but very profound, and often one that it's hard to put a label on it, because it's a composite of lots of different emotional states. It's not pure fear, it's not pure anger, it's not pure love. It's like a combination of lots of different emotions put together. And that part will speak about you and use the third person when it talks about you. I think that gives us a fair amount of certainty or confidence that it's possible for parts to completely take control. And if that is the case, then you've got to assume that there's probably only one part in control at any moment in time. Otherwise, it'd be rather like if you've got two people trying to drive a bus. It's like it sort of works for a very short period of time, but you're going to crash pretty soon. So it seems likely that parts are in control of your body, that is the mechanism, because there has to be some way of moving your limbs. I mean, I asked my arm to go up and it goes up, but I don't know what muscles are in the arm, and I certainly don't know how to target them in the correct sequence to make it move like that. I also didn't give a very specific trajectory that I wanted the arm to move. It just went up. So we have to assume that there is something that translates that high level instruction of move the arm to something more specific. And it's reasonable to assume that it's a part of the unconscious mind that's doing that there is some discrete system of control that's involved, which is why when you drive a car, everything is quite easy and quite automatic. But as you sit there, and if I asked you which one's the gas pedal, you'd probably have to think about it, because the part of you that drives the car just knows which pedal to push. I know that because I very rarely drive, and when I do, I still know which pedal to push. But I honestly couldn't tell you right now. I have no idea if it's the left one or the right one. So it's pretty reasonable to assume that parts of the unconscious mind control the body, and that there's only one part in control at any moment in time. Now, occasionally you might have parts that are sort of vying for control, but most of the time I think it's likely that there's only one part that's in control at any moment in time.
This can be a cause of frustration, I think, for a lot of people, because I think most people listening right now probably have had the experience of making a New Year's resolution where they absolutely do want to make that change, whatever that change is, lose weight, go to the gym, or whatever it might be. And then could be days, could be hours, could be weeks later, they're definitely doing something that entirely 100% contradicts the very thing that they absolutely wanted to do. In your experience, is this just that a different part is doing that new behavior that contradicts a different part, that when that was in the seat driving that particular bus, yes, it absolutely did want to do that thing, but it's not also in the driving the bus later on when there's some kind of different motive?
Yeah, that's certainly one way that it can happen. Most people experience that they sort of talk themselves into doing it. It's not as if they suddenly have no control, that the conscious mind still needs to acquiesce to the demand. It's just that you know that after a while, there is no way to shut this voice up, right? Once it starts nagging you to have a cigarette, once it starts nagging you to break the diet and have a chocolate biscuit, there is just no way to shut that voice up apart from to give in to it. And that's why people keep going back, because their mind just becomes an extremely unpleasant place for as long as they're trying to change this behavior through willpower alone. Whenever the will comes into conflict with the imagination, there's an idea that the imagination is always going to win. And I think that's what we're seeing here, is that the internal world that you have is hugely influenced by the conversation between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind, and particularly the parts of the unconscious mind, because I think that's generally what we speak to. Very rarely do people go inside and speak directly to their unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind has not so many reasons to communicate with you directly. But the parts of the unconscious mind, on the other hand, I think it's much more common that people go inside and they talk to the parts of their unconscious mind, even if they don't realize it. And that's why they wake up in the morning and they think, well, today's the day that I'm going to make this diet last. And it gets to lunchtime, and the part of them that likes to go off and have Burger King at lunch has stepped in and started driving the bus. And their conscious mind is still wedded to the idea of today's the day to make the diet last. And the part of them that wants Burger King starts coming up with all sorts of reasons why today is not the day to make the diet last. And this is going to go on all day if that part decides that that's what it's going to do. And the conscious mind knows that. So it's a question of, well, how long does the conscious mind want to put off having that Burger King? Okay, are you going to have it for lunch, or are you going to have it for dinner? Because you're already starting to recognize that sooner or later, you're going to give in to this nagging voice. And I think one of the reasons why people have a tendency to give into these nagging voices is because that's what we teach our children to do. We teach our children, well, if you're good, then you can have a chocolate biscuit. So you basically get a reward just for existing as a child. So we program this in, and then 20 years later, you've got this child inside of your head that you know it's not going to shut up until you give it a chocolate biscuit. And it keeps nagging away, nagging away, nagging away. There's a number of solutions to that. I think the most elegant solution is to build a relationship with that part and be a responsible parent to that part. And that's somewhat the idea of inner child work. I think that what we're exploring here is a slightly more subtle variant of it, where we're thinking, well, there's not just one inner child, but there's actually a community of kids on the inside, and some of them are all like they're fine, and some of them are highly traumatized, and some of them are badly behaved, and some of them are selfish, and some of them just whinge all the time. And you want to evolve them, and all to the point where they act a bit more maturely, which is why you may have, when people give up smoking on their own, I think it's quite often the case that they wake up one day and they just don't smoke. And that's it. And they just never smoke again. And they've tried giving up before, and they've tried giving up many, many, many times. But then one day they wake up in the morning and they're like, oh, I'm just not going to smoke today. And then they just forget about it. And it's not difficult for them. Like, the one time that they give up smoking was the attempt where it was easy. And I suspect that that's the point at which the part of them that wanted to smoke decided that it didn't want to smoke anymore, right? And it stopped nagging them, and then smoking just vanished for them. So it's normal that we have these experiences where parts of the unconscious mind evolve and mature all by themselves. However, it's also possible for people to create those experiences internally by changing their relationship to the parts of their unconscious mind, which means changing your appreciation of the conversation that goes on in your head. Most people don't really think of having a conversation in their head. They think of it as being a kind of a monologue, almost like they're writing their autobiography in their own thinking. But the reality is that there's always the potential there to have a conversation between the voice that you completely control 100%, that you can use to say anything, and the voice that you have no control over.
I think it's really interesting at that point because, you know, to the average person, you stop a person on the street and you say, you know, how would you describe someone that has voices inside their head? And they're probably going to say, you know, mad, crazy, schizophrenic. But the reality is we all do this. We all have these kind of voices in our head. And sometimes it takes cartoons or comic strips where they have got the devil and the angel on either shoulder before people kind of accept, oh yeah, I do that. You know, I have this kind of voice that's trying to, you know, steer me and tempt me into doing kind of things that, you know, I've already decided I don't want to do. In terms of, because it sounds, you know, from what you said before, the goal isn't to banish these voices or banish these parts, but to cultivate some kind of dialogue and communication and kind of get them on side so that they're helpful rather than hindering. How easy is that to do in your experience?
Depends. I found it quite extraordinarily easy on occasion, most times, in fact, when you do the right sequence of things. But like with everything in this line of work, sometimes there's really complex issues that you need to deal with. I think every single hypnotherapist that I've ever met has one really blatant and obvious thing that you think you could swat away with hypnotherapy, and it would be like hypnotherapy 101. And 10, 20, 30 years down the line, they are still struggling with it, because most things are pretty simple and some things are actually very, very complex. But there is a sequence of things that you need to go through in order to be able to change the relationship you have to the parts of your unconscious mind. And everyone pretty much suggests that you start in the wrong place. So people always suggest that you start off by being kind to yourself. And it's like, yeah, okay, but that's hard. And it doesn't seem to work, because you're being really kind to yourself. You're pouring the positivity on, you're doing all of these wonderful affirmations. And then suddenly you hear a voice from the inside that says, yeah, but you're stupid and ugly and no one will ever love you, or whatever it is. You know, everyone's got their own unique voice or collection of voices that come up and seem to drag them back down. So, well, then how do you respond to that? You've been pouring all the kindness in and you just get this resentment back. Like, what's going on there? Well, if you think about what that would be like if you had that situation with an actual person. Let's say you were working with someone and you fell out and things were really awkward between you. And then out of nowhere, this other person just starts being really, really kind to you. I don't know about you, but I would be fairly suspicious. I'd be thinking, what's going on here? They're up to something. But if they sat down with me and said, listen, Matt, I don't like the way that things are going right now. I think you're a decent bloke. Can we start again? And then they started being kind to me. I'd be likely to think, okay, well, let's see where this goes. Right? I'm open to it and I'll reciprocate because I know what's going on. I wouldn't worry that this was some manipulative button pushing exercise. Whereas most people use kindness and self-compassion as being a manipulative button pushing exercise. They don't care what changes at the unconscious level as long as their experience at the conscious level is improved. Because they don't recognize that there is this unconscious level. They don't recognize that there is this community of parts of the unconscious mind that are thinking for themselves, that have their own aspirations for the future, their own beliefs, their own collection of memories that they refer to, their own traumatic memories that they remember that their conscious mind doesn't. And because they don't appreciate that all of this exists at the unconscious level, they don't have any respect for it whatsoever. They think, well, my conscious experience, what can I do to improve my conscious experience? I know I'll try being kind to myself, but just for me, not for the aspect of me that I'm being kind to. That doesn't matter as long as I consciously am in a better place. And the unconscious responds with resentment, unsurprisingly. That's why it gets resisted. There was an interesting book that I think came out in the 70s called Intimate Behavior, which it maps out mating behavior in the human species. And it turns out there's a number of steps that you need to go through if you want to have sex with another human being, which is not too much of a surprise to anyone who's ever had sex. But what was interesting was that there's 12 steps, and I guess like, yeah, okay, fine, 12 steps. If you miss one of those steps, your chances of successfully having a sexual encounter reduced by 50%. But if you miss 2 steps, it's assault. Because you need to follow this very specific sequence in order for people to understand what the next escalation means. And to give you an example of this, if you walked up to somebody in the pub and you grabbed their hand and you started shaking it, having never looked them in the eye and never said hello, they might think that was an assault, right? They might hit you for that. It would be fair enough to misunderstand that. But if you do say hello and look them in the eye, then it's a handshake. So you can't leap straight into being kind to yourself and expect that that's actually going to work. You need to first of all do something that states your intent so that the parts of your unconscious mind understand what it is that you're trying to do. And your intent must be to make it better, not just for you as a conscious mind, but also for the community that's in the unconscious mind as well. And people may be listening to this and thinking, well, that's kind of far-fetched, that you have all of these sort of like parts of you that are living in the unconscious mind that really have that much of an impact on your life. But every single person listening to this show is far more intelligent than any computer on the planet. And that means far more intelligent than all of the servers that make up Alexa or Google Assistant or Siri, because we do things that those AIs cannot do. And they are composed of discrete component parts that think for themselves and have their own very specific purposes and reference their own collection of data and, you know, all of the things that we're saying that these parts of the unconscious mind do. If you want to build a sophisticated system, that's how you build it. You build it with discrete parts of the system that are specialized for particular purposes. If you build a company, then you don't, as a CEO, think, well, I don't need any employees, I'll just do everything, because it's not a very efficient structure and you can't scale it to any degree of complexity. If you are sailing a boat, then you need other people to sail the boat most of the time. Otherwise, you're sailing quite a small boat. The unconscious mind is the same, that you consciously aren't doing the whole thing. And everyone knows that they're not consciously running the show. They're involved in it. They may have some executive control over it, but they're not doing the whole thing. It's parts of the unconscious mind that are responsible for doing a great deal of keeping us safe and promoting our happiness. Mm-hmm. So the relationship that you have with these, you can think of it as being rather like, you can think of it as being parental. That's one way to think about it, that you have something of a duty, a responsibility to make sure that they they feel encouraged and that they feel safe to be brave and to go out into the world and to do difficult things. But you can also think of it as being rather like a captain in a ship. That your captain on the inside would be your conscious mind, but then the crew is the parts of the unconscious mind. And you as a captain, you just give instructions. Like when I ask my arm to go up, the arm goes up, but I don't know what muscles to move. I just have to trust that the arm's going to go up. But if I don't ask, the arm probably doesn't go up, right? So you as a conscious mind have this executive control. You can control your body, you can control your mind, but only through the cooperation of the parts of your unconscious mind. It's like the crew on a ship will obey the captain, and you get the occasional mutiny, right? And that is what people experience.
Absolutely. It's other people sneaking into the captain's chair or heckling the captain from behind the shoulder to kind of influence what that captain does. And, obviously this metaphor of all these kind of different parts, sometimes they're working together as a team, in a well-run ship or company, sometimes they're in conflict, uses this kind of theory of parts therapy. But, a different variation of parts therapy is ego state therapy. What would you consider is the key distinction difference between standard parts therapy and ego state therapy? What makes it different?
I don't know that there is a difference. I think that ego state therapy is a flavor of parts therapy. Because yes, there is sort of the hypnotic parts therapy for conflict resolution that Roy Hunter teaches, that's based, I think, on the work of Charlie Tebbett. And it's not really that different than the ego state therapy you'll find in Gordon Emerson's book. So I don't know that there's a great deal of distinction to be made. There are lots of different approaches to parts therapy, like there's parts therapy in NLP, for example, and it has a very different appreciation of what parts are. So I think that really it's a question of how people understand parts rather than what you do with them. Within NLP, they're understood predominantly as being a problem, right? To the extent that they're even labeled as being a problem part. Within hypnosis, we tend to avoid that kind of thinking and say, well, there's no such thing as a bad part, but there are parts that have problems. And the way that I like to think about it is that if you went skiing and you fell over and you broke your arm and you look down and it's all mangled, your first thought probably isn't, oh, might as well chop that off then. Right? Your first thought is, it hurts, but it's still my arm. I want it back. I want to enjoy it again. So you do what's required to heal it. And I think that it's wise to think of parts in the same way, that you can't get rid of them and you shouldn't think of them as being bad parts, even if they're causing you pain, any more than you should think of an arm as being a bad arm just because it's broken. It can get better, right? It can improve, you can enjoy it, it can heal. And I think that parts, unlike arms, can heal pretty much entirely because there are specific trauma therapies that we can do within parts. And even working over things like video call, we can do trauma therapy within parts that releases you from the stuck patterns of emotional response. So, for example, let's say that somebody has a negative emotional state that comes up whenever they're in front of an audience, and it's been with them since they were about 13. One of the things that we can do with hypnotic parts therapy or with ego state therapy, or with some of the other approaches like my version, which is called Limitless Mind, is to be able to work directly with parts, to speak directly to parts, or rather to have a conversation directly with parts. And they know when this stuff started. And they can guide us back to the moment where this problem first started, which, with a public speaking issue is more often than not being asked to read in front of the class. And finding that you stand up there and the mind goes blank and everyone's laughing at you because they're kids. And then you get stuck with that negative emotional response that comes up every time you're in a situation that feels somewhat similar. So with parts therapy within hypnosis and within psychodynamic theory and so on, you can return to those moments and you can release those emotions, reprocess the memory, and then the negative state that was there disappears. And it's through a process of thinking, well, let's heal the state, versus something like NLP, which would be more along the lines of, well, let's reprogram that area of the neurology. So ego state therapy, I think it's probably like one of the earliest examples of understanding parts of the unconscious mind as being person-like, whereas parts within NLP just doesn't have that appreciation of them at all. And the reason why ego state therapy thinks of them as being person-like is because the original creators of ego state therapy, John and Helen Watkins, I think, they were working with people who had multiple personality disorder. And they were psychoanalyzing them, and they found that, well, this was at a time when people were dubious about whether or not multiple personalities or dissociative identity disorder was a real thing or just something that people were kind of making up to get off serious crimes. And they were finding that, well, in the multiple, what you have is the parts of the unconscious mind. One of them fragments off so completely that it no longer talks to the other parts of the unconscious mind. And that's usually because there's been some extreme childhood abuse that's been repeated, and maybe the kid's been told, if you ever tell anyone about this, then I'll kill you. So this part splinters off, and it has no contact with the rest of the child's life, because you need to keep this a secret, right? Otherwise you're going to be in real trouble. But this part just has nothing but abuse and pain and frustration and fear. And as that child grows up into an adult, that part starts to take on more and more of a life of itself. It finds expression, particularly when the traumatic abuse is gone. Well, this part still comes up from time to time. It still takes control from time to time, only because it's completely independent of the other personalities and the other parts of the unconscious mind. It will go off and do its own thing, and there is no memory that is transmitted from one personality to the other personality. So you have complete amnesia. A person will say, sorry, my light is going off. A person will say, I don't know what I did on Tuesday. I know that I didn't go to the football, but I don't know what I did on Tuesday. Well, they did go to the football on Tuesday. And it was a part of their unconscious mind that went there. And it went there in its role as the entire personality at that point in time. And no memory whatsoever is transmitted back to the main personality, if you like, or the conscious mind.
In multiple personality disorder, each of these parts can be in the executive. They're in control. They're in the driver's seat. It's just that all the other parts have no idea about that because there's no communication. In kind of these conflicted parts, obviously, it sounds like if you heal them rather than banish them, and kind of get to the positive intention, that can massively improve things. Is there any evidence or examples of people creating new parts or improving the parts that are there, not necessarily to solve a trauma, but to enable people to be better than they were before?
Yes, I think that there's different ways that we can understand parts. A part that could go on to become an entire personality within a multiple, I don't think you could create something like that deliberately. A part that is very skilled at playing the cello, I think that you have to create that deliberately. And I think that they are arguably both parts of the unconscious mind, because they have this very, very specific skill set, emotional resources that are sort of wrapped up into it, and both triggered in very specific times and places. Like the person who's skilled at playing a cello, as soon as they have the cello in their hands, that part steps in. And if you play a musical instrument, you know that feeling that as soon as you've got the instrument in your hand, you know how to play it. And it's not the only time that you feel that way, because sometimes you'll be listening to a piece of music and then the part of you that plays the cello steps in, and you have the overwhelming desire to play the cello. So you can create these parts, and in fact, everyone does. I think most people who learn to drive, you have to create a part that can drive a car, because it's way too complex as a behavior. I suspect that this is a pretty common experience people have. Before you get into the driver's seat for the first time, you think, how hard can it be? It's got to be pretty simple because you've seen other people driving, and in your head you know that you can drive. And then you get in there and there's too many pedals, and it's the immediate total overwhelm. And that first 2 hours of driving is some of the most stressful time you have ever spent doing anything. And then every lesson is like that. That's why people are so happy when they pass their test. It's not just that they've got the freedom, it's that they don't have to go through that anymore. And you are literally creating a part that can do a very, very complex behavior, and a behavior that has a high risk associated to it. I don't think people would be so stressed about driving if we all learned to drive in simulators, right? Because it doesn't really matter. You can't really die. So you do create parts, and you create them by putting an awful lot of stress in there. It's the same with learning to play a musical instrument. Very often that's a stressful thing. You have to keep coming back to it because you keep failing over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then you have a little glimmer of hope where things get easier, and then more failure. And then eventually it gets to the point where you have internalized this very, very complex behavior, and you can do it automatically. So we could think of that as being a part of the unconscious mind at that point. But it would be a part that's of a very different logical type than the kind of part that's capable of going off and becoming a full personality within the multiple. But also I think it's unlikely that multiple personalities would be manifested in someone sort of later in life.
That makes
That it
sense.
tends to be, it takes this early fracturing of the psyche to create it. So it's unlikely that you'd have someone who has a part that can drive a car, or the part that drives the car that then suddenly goes off and takes on a life of its own, where all you do is drive cars, and then total amnesia for it.
And you said it's normally trauma that kind of creates, not, I mean, if we move away from, multiple personality, dissociative identity disorder, and focus on kind of parts that most people kind of have in their unconscious mind, trauma is one of these things that can create that part. But you said emotional intensity. Could it be an overwhelmingly intense positive emotion that could also create those parts? Is that also a possibility?
Certainly come across that. So one of the really fascinating things about this whole area of the human mind is that some of it's a bit theoretical, and then we get the opportunity to find out, because you can just ask people, and you get such consistent responses that come back. For example, most parts have a name, which is extraordinary because they don't have names that you'd necessarily expect. Sometimes they have like names of other people. Somebody who's never really met anyone called Benjamin has a part called Benjamin. The responses that people give when you ask them these questions can either verify or very quickly discredit theories about how parts work. So we've ended up with this sort of agreed upon understanding within hypnosis about what parts are and how they work. And it's in a number of books, and there's not a huge number of books on the topic that I'm aware of, but it's in a number of books, and there's enough of a consistency that we can sort of say, well, this is probably what parts are, and this is how they probably work. What was your question again?
Yeah, if a part can be created by an overwhelmingly intense positive emotion, not necessarily trauma.
Yeah, so I've definitely had that. I was surprised the first time it came up, because it wasn't something that's particularly in the literature. It tends to revolve around negative emotions, because it's generally the case that it's the parts that are created at times of trauma that have problems. However, I've come across parts that have manifested problems because they were created in a moment of intense joy, and their purpose was to create more of those experiences. And they're feeling like the person no longer does any of the things that allow it to do its job. So you get friction and resistance, and you get internal criticism and so on from the part. And when you ask what's going on, the part says, well, you're wasting your life. You spend all the time working, and you don't spend any time at all doing anything that really matters. And there's no history of trauma within the part at all. It's a very, very joyful part. It's just very neglected. And it's feeling disheartened as a result of the way that it's seeing the person's life play out. And it becomes increasingly interruptive as a force in their life, and as a voice in their mind.
For a long period of time, psychology mainly looked at problems, kind of issues, things like that. But we have seen a trend in more recent times of positive psychology, looking at how we can take the principles of understood theories to kind of just improve our happiness and kind of overall well-being. Do you think it's possible to, let's say, install parts or positive, resourceful emotional states so that even if someone's not particularly in conflict, they're not particularly in a bad way, they don't feel like they're mentally ill, could still benefit from our knowledge of parts or ego state or whatever you want to call it, to just simply be more motivated, more confident, more successful, things like that?
Yeah, so wherever there's a desire for more, it suggests there's an obstacle that is preventing you from having it already. You can install parts, but it's generally the case that you've got enough. And it's hard work to install them as well. I mean, yes, you can install things in hypnosis, but then you have to go out and collect the memories and the information and the practical experience and the feedback and the muscle memory to make it meaningful, to make it worthwhile doing that. It's not as if you can just reprogram someone with hypnosis and they then have a real world skill immediately. They have the capacity for a real world skill that perhaps they didn't have before, but they need to go off and they need to have those experiences and they need to get better at it and refine it. So it's easier to think in terms of, well, with what you've got on the inside, what is it that's not working in the way that you would like it to? And people, when they hear the word trauma, they tend to immediately think that's got to be some big thing. And it's rarely some big thing. The way that we work is that we don't make massive decisions at the level of our identity about who we are or about how the world is when we're under tremendous amount of stress. So when we're experiencing massive trauma, we just go into like emergency survival mode and we do what we've always done and we hope that it's good enough to survive. It's when we're under a certain amount of stress, not so much that we go into that fight or flight emergency survival mode, but just enough that we know that something has to change. And we start making decisions about the world and about ourselves, and we start changing our behaviors. And often we change them in a way which at the moment seemed like a smart thing to do, but you roll it forward 30, 40 years, it's highly problematic. And that's why you make a decision when you're sort of 6 years old, and maybe it's an I'm not good enough kind of decision. And then 30 years later, you're achieving all of this stuff and it always feels hollow. So you're continually trying to achieve more, trying to achieve more, trying to achieve more. But whenever you get there, you have this kind of imposter feeling. And it's not because you're not achieving enough, and it's not because you need more skills to achieve things. It's because of your understanding of who you are. When you transform your understanding of who you are, what happens is that motivation is released naturally. And it's motivation to go off and be more of what you are, rather than motivation to go off and prove something to somebody else, which I think is what an awful lot of goal achievement is. Even if it's the kind of thing that you can evaluate it and say like, well, yeah, I mean, I really do want a Ferrari because I love cars. But if your evidence criteria for knowing that it's meaningful is somebody seeing you drive the Ferrari, then you have a problem, right? That means you can never fully enjoy the Ferrari, right? So if you didn't have that, then you would be able to go off and create the Ferrari and enjoy it for whatever it is, and also be totally at peace with not having the Ferrari until you get it. So I think that working on things that you might think of as being trauma, and trauma is often, you fell off the swings when you were 6 years old, or someone pushed you over in the playground and you don't remember it because it's innocuous. So finding these moments and transforming them using either hypnotic parts therapy, ego state therapy, or my limitless mind techniques means that you do have more success. You do achieve a great deal more, but it doesn't have this negative emotion that's propelling you to do it. Most people's motivation strategies has at least some negative emotion in it. And for me, that's not a good trade. It doesn't matter how much you achieve. If you achieve it through having negative emotions present, pain and suffering pushing you forward, you're not really living your most actualized life. You're just living one that from the outside looks good. And I don't really think that that's the most helpful situation for anyone, when you could achieve just as much, if not more, and have everything on the inside be completely harmonious.
Going back to your metaphor about the ship's captain and the crew, or the CEO and the employees, in real life, if the ship's captain wanted to have, an overall better crew, well, he might got two choices. You either hire better crew members, or you train the crew members on there to be more competent. Um, in a corporate entity, the CEO might headhunt the very best in the industry and kind of have them as part of his overall team or board, or again train them up. There are people out there that have incredible abilities. There might be, someone that is just naturally able to be very, very creative or charismatic or very disciplined or determined. How feasible is it for someone to take those attributes and either upgrade their parts or um, swap them around for kind of better parts? Is that kind of science fiction, or is this even in the realms of possibility?
I like to have a very open mind about what my parts are capable of. I don't like to think that there's better parts out there somewhere, because I'm uniquely me, and everybody else is uniquely them, and they are the product of their conscious mind and their unconscious mind, and there's nothing that you can really do to change that. So the parts of your unconscious mind, you can't just swap them with somebody else, much as you might like to. You kind of have your collection of parts in the unconscious mind, they have their collection of parts. However, your collection of parts guaranteed has all sorts of limiting beliefs and traumas and conflicts and like all of this stuff. And everyone is tremendously capable. They don't really use that capacity, but they have tremendous capability. But their motivation machine is kind of clogged up with all of these limiting beliefs and inner conflicts and traumas and so on. So I don't think that you need to try and take apart from somebody else. I think the first thing that you should do is to look at your system right now and give it a damn good clean. Because whilst it's running with all of this gunk, you're not going to know what you're capable of, and you may actually be capable of far more than what you desire to do. It may be the case that you look at somebody else and you see the way that they're achieving it and you think, well, if only I could achieve the same thing the same way that they do, I'd be happy. But that's not necessarily the case, because you don't know how they achieve it. You don't know which memories are being processed under the surface, and maybe they don't either. Maybe they achieve it in such a way that they appear happy on the outside, but they're actually very disturbed by their internal experience on the inside. So when you model somebody else, it's one thing to take the behavior, but it's another thing entirely to think that you can copy the internal structure, because there may be some internal processes that you can copy, but you cannot copy the internal memories. And this is something that has been very much missing from things like NLP. The idea that it's all very procedural. But as a computer programmer, I know it's not all procedural, because a big part of it is data, right? You need some data that you feed into these procedures, and then you end up with an output. So if you have a process on a computer that, let's say, it puts a filter on an image, well, what makes the biggest difference is not the filter, it's the image that you feed into it. Now, it may all look somewhat similar at the end of it, but if you have two different images, you will have two different results every single time. No matter how sophisticated the filter is, it will always produce two different results, because that's what it's designed to do. And it's the same with processes in the unconscious mind, that you can look at a process somebody else is running and think, wow, that's really amazing that they can do that. But they're running it with their own unique data. So one place where I think that computing has an awful long way to go to catch up with human beings is that we combine data and process all of the time with everything that we do. We don't make that much of a distinction between what is information and what is process. Whereas, your computer, for example, you've got a hard drive, and that's where all the data is, and then you've got chips where all the processing of that data takes place, and the data doesn't really reside on the chip for very long. It goes back into storage. And that's not necessarily how we are. We don't know how many of these memories are being processed and what they're being used for, and so on. All we know is the kind of end result. So to look at somebody else and think, well, I'll just model them and I'll achieve happiness in the same way, or success in the same way that they do. It's like, yeah, okay, you might, but it won't be the same as them. It will be unique to you, and you might get a much better result by just starting off through clearing out the gunk that's in your motivation machine, and then seeing what you're actually capable of, without any need to change anything else.
I think it's a really valid point. Why adopt something new if you can just kind of, get the crap out of the way that's kind of stopping you from being the best version of yourself anyway. You've mentioned a couple of times about limitless mind, your kind of um, approach, let's say, to kind of tapping into more of what we're capable of. And some people may have seen, the movie Limitless and things like that, or they might look at people either current or from history, visionaries like Disney, for example, or a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk or sports people and say, I want to tap into a bit of that resourcefulness or qualities and things like that. What do you think is the most with what we know about the mind, psychology, these kind of different theories? What is the most useful approach to be able to become, let's say, capable, not necessarily have the same memories or experience, but the same qualities, the drive, the resources of people like that?
Well, my first question would always be, well, why do you want to achieve that? It's not necessarily something that's going to make you happy.
Well, I
Um,
think I think for a lot of people, they might, um, you know, let's say read an autobiography, and I think for a lot of people that read an autobiography of someone, could be a sports person, could be, someone famous. I think a lot of it is because a part of them might aspire to be like that. It doesn't mean they want to be them, but they might admire the qualities within them and think at some level, oh, I'd love to be as charismatic as that person, or as funny as that person, or as disciplined as whoever it might be. So
I
I
think it
think
just
I think that's a
answers your
fairly
own
common.
question. You said there's a part of them that wants to do that. Well, if there's a part of them that already wants to do it, then you encourage that part to go off and do it, right? You don't respond to that part when it tells you that it wants to do it by saying, "Oh, we could never do that." And if you find that it's the part that's saying, "Oh, I want to do that, but I could never do that," you respond to it in the same way that, I mean, you have kids and they probably come up to you sometimes and say, "Well, I want to do this, but I don't think I can do this." And you encourage them and say, "Well, why don't you try?" So if you encourage that part of you that already wants to do those things, you may very well find that that part of you, it resonated with that message because it had the raw materials to be able to do the thing, to be charismatic in that way, to be successful, to be logical, to be creative, whatever it is, that it already had what was necessary. It just perhaps didn't know that it was going to be supported in its endeavors, right? It's like if you've got a kid that wants to play the piano and you don't support them in their desire to play the piano, they probably won't get over that initial phase where they suck at it. But if you tell them, keep practicing, you're sounding better, they get over that hump to the point where they can start enjoying it. So it's really about, if there's a part of you that wants to do something, and it's something that you think is probably in your best interests, or is, maybe even not in your best interest, as long as it's not damaging to you, that you provide the encouragement from the inside, and that you recognize, well, you're now allowing a part of you to go in that direction. It's not in some sort of vague metaphorical sense where, oh, that's just language, it's just the way that people talk, but in the very real sense that, well, there is a part of you that feels that it could do that, or that it really wants to do that. And if it really wants to do that, then you provide it with the opportunities.
Mm,
It's really about not holding yourself back when a part of you recognizes that. And most people do, because they think, well, parts of me aren't me. And in some sense, that's because they don't appreciate that when they think of themselves, they mostly think of their conscious mind. It's something that you mentioned before we started this podcast, that when you do work with people, um, you can tell when they're associated into a part, because they'll start talking about themselves using the pronoun you. And when they're not associated into the part, they'll talk about themselves using the pronoun I. And it's really fascinating to think, well, why is it that people don't really distinguish between when they talk about themselves as you and when they talk about themselves as I? It's a question of whether or not they're associated into a part, and it's a question of whether or not they're encouraging that part.
absolutely. And one of the things that, I think is frustrating for a lot of people is when they have got these highly developed parts, but they're in the, let's use the metaphorical captain's chair, at the wrong time. So I think in a lot of people, there is a part of them that loves, an audience, that loves to perform, but they're not necessarily in the captain's chair at the point where they've got an audience. What's the, let's say that you've got these kind of parts, is there any kind of best way so that the right person is in the right chair at the right time?
Yeah, it's very often about healing up the traumas, because it happens so quick that you don't really get time to react to it. Something happens, you're triggered into a negative emotional state, and then it's too late because you're already in that negative emotional state. And even if another state comes along that's a bit more resourceful and manages to take control, it's not as if you immediately transition into a positive emotional state. You still have that negative state hanging around. So the only way to make sure that the right part is in control at the right point in time, is to do things like ego state therapy or the limitless mind coaching techniques, because you need to work directly with the parts and you need to request that they reorganize. Like I was saying before, that you've got a part that wants to be an engineer. Well, that doesn't mean to say that they can just go off and be an engineer. They need to have permission to do that. But as soon as they've been given permission by the captain, well, then they can start working in that area. So one of the things that we can do with therapy is we can request that parts reorganize, and it's extremely effective. So I had one lady who I was working with. She had an extreme vomit phobia, and it was like 11 out of 10. And we worked with it really quickly, and it pretty much disappeared. And what she was left with was this part that whenever she was exposed to or around vomit, like she'd feel her chest absolutely like rattling around. And when there was no need for that anymore, because it was all the part did was the vomit phobia, I said, well, what would you like to do? And the part said, well, I'd quite like to be involved in the singing, because she was a semi-professional singer. So the part then started to take more of a role in the singing, because it was very good at working with the muscles that are involved. And her singing went dramatically from one level to the next level, because there had been this reorganization. So there is plenty that you can do with the parts of your unconscious mind. I guess, in a nutshell, this is a complex topic. So I'm guessing that the podcast that you do, probably the people who are still listening at this stage of this podcast have something of an interest in fairly abstract topics of psychology, because it is complex. And in order to be able to work with this stuff, you need to have enough of an understanding of what parts are, how they're influencing your life, and when they're coming up, and how you should respond to them in those moments. When you have all of that, you can do the most tremendous personal evolution with it, because you can speak to parts, you can find out what's going on, you can track down the exact memory in the past which is responsible for the problem that you have now. Whether it's something that's a big problem, like a phobia, or whether it's something that's a very small problem, like a tedious negative emotional state that comes up every time you're speaking to an authority figure. You can track it down, you can release the trauma that created that negative state, and then you can specify how you want things to be different. And you can do it in a very simple and very conversational way, that you're just inside and having a chat to the parts of your unconscious mind. But a few things need to happen for you to get to that point. The first thing is you need to repair the relationship with the parts of your unconscious mind, because for most people, they're in the realms of being quite rude and obnoxious to themselves all the time. If you're saying, oh, I'm so stupid, to yourself, it's like, well, you wouldn't say that to somebody else, right? If you do an acid test of, well, if I take I off and turn it into a you state, and it's like, I'm so stupid, you're so stupid, right? But you wouldn't dream of saying that. It's very impolite, and you wouldn't have any friends. But we say it to ourselves all the time as though it doesn't mean anything. I'm such an idiot, or shut up. All of these kind of things that we think that have no real impact, because we're just saying them to ourselves, and it's just me in here, right? They have a tremendous impact. And you need to step back, you need to step away from all of these things. Otherwise, you can't expect that the parts of your unconscious mind are going to trust you enough to open up to you and to allow you to help them. Rather, like if you If you walk through the playground and you see that there's a little 5-year-old that's fallen over, they're clutching their knee, it's bleeding, and they're crying, and you go, "Oh, honey, what's wrong?" They might say, "I hurt my knee." They might say that. But if you see that same little kid and they're crying in the playground for no reason, and you ask them what's going wrong, they might not tell you, because there could be something going on at home, or maybe they're being bullied or something. But if they trust you, they might start to open up to you. They might tell you actually what's going on. So to get into the more sophisticated ways of working with parts, so that you can release resources, so that you can track down and heal up traumas, so that you can get reorganizations, so that you can create things like inner harmony and like a genuine inner peace, you need to start off by changing the relationship that you have to your unconscious mind and the parts of your unconscious mind. And that doesn't start with being kind to yourself. I think we sort of started talking about this a little bit earlier. It doesn't start with being kind to yourself, because it's a really manipulative thing to do. It starts with being polite and saying, well, I want things to be different, and I want them to be different in this way. And I recognize that you, parts of the unconscious mind, are there, and you've always been there. And reflecting on it, my behavior has been pretty appalling. Because if you've been habitually sort of calling yourself an idiot, then that's a pretty appalling thing to do, even if it's something that everyone does. Where you put it into this way of understanding what's happening under the surface, almost everyone is being incredibly abusive to themselves, which is why there's so much anxiety. It's why there's so much depression. It's why there's so much self-sabotage. It's why there's so much not good enough going on. If you're not totally respectful to your unconscious mind, you can't expect your unconscious mind to be totally respectful to you. So it starts with repairing the relationship with the unconscious mind, and then it moves into finding out what's in your unconscious mind, because everyone's different and we're very complex. Like what's on my iPhone is not the same as what's on your iPhone, and it's a bone, for God's sake. It's nothing compared to us as human beings. So understanding what's actually within us, what parts we have, what memories there are that are actually salient and important to the part, but seem innocuous and irrelevant to you as the conscious mind. Because parts have a very different perspective and a very different collection of memories that they work from. So when you demand that you are correct as the conscious mind because you've decided where your life should go, well, to some degree, you may get the final say, the executive control on all of this stuff. But if you're always right and you never listen to anybody else's opinion, then you're not going to be respected. And you need to have that level of trust and openness and respect before you can really get into working with the parts of the unconscious mind and do the sophisticated stuff like what we do in Limitless Mind.
That makes sense. It's a really valid point in, essentially taking it out of what's inside someone's head and putting it into a real life example. I was working with a guy who had a thanatophobia, so this compulsive thoughts and fear of death. And there was this inner voice, and this inner voice kept reminding him, and this is kind of like many times a day, you're going to die soon, you're going to be rotting in the ground. I said, look, let's just imagine that you had someone that you knew, not very well, but you knew them, and every now and then pop their head around the door and said, you're going to die soon, you're going to be rotting in the ground. What would you do to that person? And he said, well, I'd punch them in the face. I'd tell them to shut up. He wouldn't tolerate it if it was real life, but he just kind of accepted it as kind of that was his reality if it was a voice inside his own head. So yeah, very, very important to kind of start seeing the significance of, what would be the impact if this was like a real life conversation. Would you tolerate it in that case? If someone's listening to this right now and they're thinking, you know what, I do need to kind of clean up the crap, say unclog all of the things that are getting in the way, or they're just kind of fascinated this idea that they could kind of, let's say, take off the handbrake and kind of take off the limits of their own mind. What would be the best way that they can connect with you or reach out to you?
So the easiest thing to do is to go to my Limitless Mind coaching website and just send me a message from there. So the site itself, it has all of the digital coaching programs on there. It's mostly a membership site for the personal coaching clients that go through the Limitless Mind program. But if people want to know more about it, then they should just pop over there and send me a message. And I can either give them a ring or I can send them more information. I'm often running webinars and so on but I couldn't promise that there'll be one on at the moment when they happen to go there. So the easiest thing is just that they send me a message and we'll connect that way.
Perfect. Matt, thank you so much for joining me on Modern Mindset today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to you at home, thanks for joining me on Modern Mindset. See you again soon for more.